Thank you, Courtney, and the Wayland Library, and Steve Engler, who I know helped organize this. I'm excited to be here tonight for just to talk with all of you. So let me pull up my slideshow. Keep my focus. All right, so you all know that you're here tonight to talk about race and equity in the suburbs. And I am going to ask folks to do a little bit of participating tonight. We'll actually have a couple breakout rooms. And as Courtney mentioned, you're encouraged to use the chat. If you have a question, feel free to throw up your hand. I'm a teacher by trade, and so definitely comfortable in the interactive space versus, as interactive as it can be. When engaging in conversations on race, racism, any other, kinds of systems of oppression, and we'll talk about that a little more in a bit, it's good to have some community norms. Some of this information might be new to folks. It might make us feel uncomfortable. And that's all normal and good and okay. And there are 4 practices that Glenn Singleton embraces that I find to be really helpful. They are that no matter how we're feeling, we want to try and stay engaged. We want to expect to experience discomfort. We want to speak our truths. So, if you're questioning something that I'm sharing or feeling like that doesn't apply to you, and maybe you want to talk about it in a breakout room or, ask a question in the chat, folks are welcome to do so and to speak from their experience. And at the same time, we want to be mindful of power and privilege. So if we're engaging in a conversation on race, and as a white woman, I know that I benefit from racist systems, I might be mindful of, framing the conversation around my personal experience, because my experience may not be the experience of everybody else. So kind of keeping that idea in our heads. And then expecting and accepting a lack of closure. I'm going to say this probably many times tonight, but anti-racism work is lifelong work. Addressing systemic issues is lifelong work. And so I have an ambitious agenda for us tonight, but we're definitely not going to address race and equity issues in the suburbs in our 1-hour session tonight, as much as we would like to, but hopefully can, plant some seeds for new ideas and thinking and change. Some other mindsets that I think are really important are just to approach trying on new ideas. So even if we've been taught something our entire lives, that does not mean that it's a truth or a fact or, an actual history, as we'll learn. And so being able to consider new points of view, new ideas, new ways of thinking that we haven't before, and just really letting them sit before we push against them. Practicing both and thinking, that just because a person has had one experience and I've had a different one, doesn't mean they can't both be realities, or that just because we're talking about things like access and privilege doesn't mean that other things aren't true. So I gave an example of my family can have worked really hard for what they have and have had access to opportunities because they are white. It's not an either or, it's both. And we don't have to dismiss one just because we believe the other thing to be true. And then lastly, just kind of paying attention to process and content. We're going to go through a lot of information, and some of it may feel like, why are we doing this? I don't know why I'm feeling uncomfortable, or what's the point of this? And just kind of paying attention to how you're feeling throughout all of it, and know that I do try to be very intentional in all the moves that I make. And so again, if you have questions about why we're doing something, feel free to drop it in the chat, either direct message me or put it for everyone. If I don't get to it tonight, I'm happy to, touch base after. I wanted to start tonight with a land acknowledgement. So if we were meeting in person tonight, we would be on Massachusetts and Pawtucket land. We know this space as the Raytheon Room at Wayland Free Public Library. Presently, with nearly 600 members, Nipmuc Nation continues to be one of New England's most historic and largest Native communities. The Massachusetts tribe are the descendants of the original people that the English invaders first encountered in what is now the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We continue to survive, we as in Massachusetts people from their website, continue to survive as Massachusetts people because we have retained the oral tradition of storytelling, just as our ancestors did. Pawtucket people, also known as Pennacook, no longer have a distinct community in New England. And this information was found at nativeland.ca. If anybody's interested at any time, finding out what land they are on, it's a really terrific resource. And I like to do a tribal land acknowledgement at the beginning of gatherings because oftentimes the Indigenous experience is erased from everyday conversations, practices, history. And the reality is that we are on Indigenous land. And, you know, we're coming here tonight to talk about the suburbs. The suburbs don't exist without Indigenous land. We can't have, you know, our golf courses and yards and just the land that we're on. Obviously, it's not only relevant to the suburbs, but that it's important that we learn the history of how we got here, and especially if we're talking about race. Indigenous history is very tied up in the story of our country and where us are currently living now. So doing a quick acknowledgement allows us to just draw attention to presence, existence, that Indigenous people are still living in Massachusetts, across the US, contributing, advocating for rights, living everyday lives. And I also like to draw attention to that we need to recognize the history of colonialism and a need for change in settler colonial societies. Racism and white supremacy have and continue to impact First Nations people. You'll see on the side that I've listed some resources and issues that are relevant to our community and also Massachusetts. I don't think I have time to go through all the resources that I mentioned tonight, but I will work with Courtney to send out a resources doc after this session. And just really quickly, I'm not gonna go through all these, same reasoning, but that I wanted to point out, so these are just some influences that I have, some texts, resources, people that have influenced me in my learning. And just wanted to do a quick shout out if you are interested in learning about Indigenous community and placing Indigenous peoples into conversation. Claudia Foxtree and Debbie Irving are having a talk on June 8th. So I just wanted to draw attention to that. And again, we'll send out all this information afterwards. All right, so I have 3 goals for tonight. We are going to be able to define racism and discuss its history and current impact, explain what race is and what it isn't, and describe racism's impact on the suburbs, and identify strategies for addressing inequities and racism in suburban communities. And just name right here again, we'll kind of be starting this conversation. We'll maybe zoom in on a few inequities or issues that we're seeing, and there's so much learning and work to do and action to take. So just wanted to temper expectations. Okay. So I'd like to start us off in some breakout rooms, and we'll keep them small. I'd love for you to just introduce yourselves, and if I could get a volunteer in each space to just record in the chat and make sure you hit enter so it's in your chat around some thoughts relating to this question: why do people move to the suburbs? If you live in one, maybe Wayland, why did you move there or here? And if you don't live in the suburbs, that's okay. Why do you think people do move to the suburbs? What is the appeal? So I'm gonna pull those up right now. And just keep them pretty small, groups 3 to 4, quick introductions, answering this question. We'll just take like 5 minutes to jot down some quick ideas, and then we'll come back and share some of those thoughts in the chat. As folks are returning, if they were note takers for their group and can copy and paste their group's notes into the chat, that would be terrific. If that's feeling like a lot, if there are a few brave souls in the group who wouldn't mind just like one or two speaking and sharing what some of the reasons were why folks moved to the suburbs. Seeing space, yard space, affordability, schools, location, grew up in Wayland. Schools, town beach, convenient to work. All right, so I'm seeing common themes of space, schools, and location. So my hope is that we can kind of keep these reasons in mind as we're moving forward. I'm seeing more good schools, and a note that good schools can be code for predominantly white. And that's something that we will explore a bunch over the next few minutes. So feel free to keep adding to the chat. I'm going to keep us moving though. So before we move forward, I know everyone's entering into the space having done, a range of learning, having had a range of experiences around racial identity, race, racism, and other systems of oppression. So I just want to go over some language really quick. So when I talk about race inequity or talking about racism, racism as defined by Beverly Daniel Tatum, and that's the definition that I'm operating under, is that racism is a system of advantage based on race. And for me, that when I first heard this definition, that was new for me when we talk about like some of the codes we might have learned when we were growing up in terms of not talking about race or just things that we internalized and how we approach conversations on race and racism. So one of the things I learned growing up was that we don't talk about race and racism because that in itself is racist and also makes people uncomfortable. And I was also taught that racism is individual acts, that individual people are racist or groups might do racist deeds, but that there wasn't a system at play that I should be exploring. And looking at racism as a system kind of changes the game a bit because there isn't one individual to pin it on. It's a system that we're all existing in. When I talk about equity, got my dictionary definition of being fair and impartial, but when engaging in these conversations, also thinking about equity versus equality. So we hear a lot about equality, and oftentimes what that leads to is thinking that everyone's going to benefit from the same thing. If we all get, if we're all treated equally, we all get the same thing, that's fair. But the reality is that not everyone may need the same thing, especially if they've faced systemic challenges or had systemic advantages. And so we like to look at things in terms of equity, which is everyone is getting what they need. I have a little graphic up here that some folks may be familiar with. This, group of folks watching a baseball game from behind a fence. Sometimes it's just equity versus equality. This one's has been expanded a little bit more to have reality, equality, which is everyone has the same box, but some people can't still see over the fence. Equity, everybody has the number of boxes that they need to see over the fence. And then justice is completely removing the fence, which is a metaphor that's commonly used when talking about equity. Or another example that a friend of mine likes to use is that equality is giving everyone a shoe, equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. If someone gave me child shoes. That'd be really nice, but it wouldn't help me in, using shoes to get me where I want to go. So when we talk about race, and again, this was some learning, unlearning that I was doing is growing up. I had internalized at whatever point in my life that race was related to biology. And the reality is that race is a social construct. It is a human invented classification system. And for these next few slides, I'm just gonna pull from a documentary, Race, the Power of an Illusion. It's a really fascinating, informative documentary. World of Wellesley shows it every year, which is a local social justice organization. Folks from Wayland are welcome to attend and process after. So if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. But they also have a resource that goes with their film, 10 Things Everyone Should Know About Race. So I'm going to kind of breeze through the first 7, but just really quickly. 1, race is a modern idea. 2, race has no genetic basis. 3, human subspecies don't exist. 4, skin color really is only skin deep. 5, most variation is within, not between races. 6, slavery predates race. That's globally. And 7, race and freedom were born together. And I think about that one through the lens of the United States, in that our country was founded on ideas of freedom. And at the same time that those ideas were being put in writing, and our society was coming together, people of different races were being enslaved. Black people at that same time. Native Americans were, having their land stolen and being pushed to new locations or facing death. And so freedom through the lens of the US, and since then, there have been many laws in place that impacted different racial groups. Freedom has only been meant for white folks, essentially. 8, race justified social inequalities as natural. And I did a little bit of explanation on these because this is where we're going to hang out for the next 35 minutes. The common sense belief in white superiority justified anti-democratic action and policies like slavery, the extermination of American Indians, the exclusion of Asian immigrants, the taking of Mexican lands, and the institutionalization of racial practices within American government, laws, and society. So those groups listed have all at one point or another, there were laws in place, that impacted all of these different groups. So when we talk about freedom not being for everyone, we have the history to track that. Race isn't biological, but racism is real. Race is a powerful social idea that gives people different access to opportunities and resources. The government and social institutions of the United States have created advantages that disproportionately channel wealth, power, and resources to white people. And then lastly, colorblindness will not end racism. Pretending race doesn't exist is not the same as creating equality. I would say equity, as we just looked at with that definition. And I would also say about number 10, colorblindness, that's another notion that I internalized growing up. Not only will colorblindness not end racism, colorblindness upholds racism. And we're gonna explore that a little bit more on this next slide. So when we talk about, and I'm just gonna keep cruising. Again, feel free to put comments, questions in the chat. When we talk about racism as a system, we're looking at this as a cycle. Beverly Daniel Tatum equates the cycle of oppression as being like a moving walkway, that if you're just kind of standing on it, you're being carried along. It's the air we breathe, we're already in it. And what this looks like is that we are born into society, we're all born. And then we have these first experiences of being socialized. And so that's when we're introduced to expectations, norms, responsibilities, habits. We're introduced to some histories and traditions, values and dreams, and potentially also myths. When we look at stories, that I heard growing up about, heroes at the time, like Columbus, or about how Thanksgiving came to be, kind of circling back to the land acknowledgement I did at the beginning. I I've since learned that some of those, that history, or what I would now call myths that I was learning, is not the actual history of what happened. But that's what was presented to me, you know, going to public school, seeing what's on our calendar as federal holidays. And so we internalize these things without even explicitly talking about them. In this stage, I also internalized certain norms, again, like ideas about not talking about race, messaging that's going to come up when we talk about housing in the suburbs a little bit, but that if you work hard, then you can achieve the American dream. And to me, as someone especially living in the suburbs, you know, there are ideas of that suburban American dream, fences, yards, space, good schools, and notions that if you work hard, then everyone being treated equally, having freedom, can achieve that dream. And then we continue to grow up, and we have a lot of influences: our family and friends, schools and teachers, religious institutions, media, books. And that kind of further either solidifies or challenges some of the thinking that we've been hearing. And if we pay attention to what we're consuming, we might notice patterns about certain kinds of representation that we're seeing, stereotypes of groups that are existing. And that starts to get kind of further internalized into our minds. So I also have these white boxes kind of hopping around. So stereotypes are generalizations about groups. When we start to prejudge folks based on those stereotypes, now we're talking about prejudice. And while these aren't lockstep, we can kind of see patterns of how some of these ideas turn into actions, which create this system. So as we grow up, we internalize notions about human difference being negative, that we need to conform to certain expectations in society, expectations around culture, expectations around what it means to be successful. And if we don't, then, you know, use this word like kind of punishment, but you may face exclusion, not having access to things that you want. So we kind of learn that we should go along with the system if we want to try and achieve success. And we also kind of further develop conscious and unconscious beliefs and attitudes. And if we start to act on those, again, you know, as individuals, but also as organizations, so acting on our prejudices and stereotypes is discrimination. So we've maybe internalized notions about groups. And then if I don't hire someone or don't, you know, choose to sell someone something, now I'm discriminating, I'm acting on my prejudices. And as we all continue to exist in the society and either feel like we're being pressured to follow these notions and conform, or we won't have access to things, or if we feel like we are trying to conform and not having access to things, we might start to question ourselves. We might start to internalize our own values and ideas about our sense of self, which can lead to feelings of self-hatred, feelings of guilt and anger. And on the other side, if we're feeling really validated in this space, then we're feeling like, hey, this feels fair, this works for me. And either way, whether we've internalized and are, you know, feeling the weight of this oppression or benefiting from it, if we continue on this cycle, we then are teaching these same values and practices to our children, and the cycle continues. And again, we are looking at this on a more systemic level, and at the same time, we all participate in that. And so I'll come back to that a little bit later. It is not hopeless, though. Got some arrows kind of jumping off, in that while we stay not doing anything, we will continue this cycle that's been existing since before the United States was even really formed. But if we do push back, do individual work, do community work, do work to address systems, then we can start to get off the cycle as individuals and as groups and as communities. And just got kind of like different labels for what that might look like. That might look like being an ally, co-conspirator, activist, but all of this requires pushing back. Inaction, status quo, ideas of, say, colorblindness mean that we continue on the cycle and that we're upholding racism. So I felt like it was kind of important for us to frame that because, as we know, there have been laws in place since the founding of our country that have impacted folks' access to certain things in the United States. And that is definitely true when it comes to suburbs and Boston also. So could go back further than 1924. But these were just like a few laws and practices that I pulled that kind of lead up to our 2019 census, that is Wayland. So in 1924, the National Association of Real Estate Boards Code of Ethics suggested that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. And what that meant was that folks who are not white would potentially be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. And so as a result of this kind of messaging across the real estate community and practices employed by the Federal Housing Administration, opportunities like the GI Bill and the loans that came with that, Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation and their practice of redlining. In Massachusetts between 1935 and 1962, the Federal Housing Administration insured more than 68,000 loans worth more than $695 million, contributing to explosive population growth in the suburbs. From 1940 to 1960, Sudbury quadrupled in size, Dedham grew by 150%, and Wayland nearly tripled. In 1960, however, they had a total of 22, 23, and 11 Black residents, respectively. With the exception of Cambridge, which we know is a city, by 1970, all of Boston's suburbs were about 98% white. And so in 1974, Boston is forced to integrate schools because of a case called Morgan versus Hennigan, which declared that Boston needed to desegregate their schools because they had stayed segregated, and that schools that had predominantly Black and brown students were not receiving the same education as schools that were predominantly white students. We also saw white flight out of the city. So all of this and so much more. And I also recognize that I might be saying terms and naming history, and that might feel like new information. As I mentioned, there's so much learning to do. So I hope folks will do some learning if needed after tonight. But basically all this results in that in 2019, our racial demographics in Wayland are 84% white, 12% Asian, 3% multiracial, and 1% Black. And while that is slightly better, our population right now currently is around 13,800. So 1% is more than 11 Black residents. We still see the impacts of racist practices leading up to the demographics of today. And we see in here things like access to land, space, and schools being only available to certain groups. So just to zoom in a little bit on the red lighting piece, this is just a map that Boston used in 1933. And basically this map existed for appraisers and mortgage lenders that for folks that were living in red neighborhoods, they had a harder time getting loans because their neighborhood was labeled as one that would not have a turnaround, a positive equity turnaround for the lending, that the neighborhood was on the decline. And blue neighborhoods were much more likely to get mortgages and to be promoted as being a neighborhood that would appreciate and create, money and equity. And these color codes were based on essentially how many Black people were living in these communities. And so you see here, you know, something that happened in 1933, where individuals having access, one, to buy property, to create equity, to do things that lead to, you know, achieving American dreams, and then also for neighborhoods also to have access to taxes, school, you know, to lift up schools, coming down to race. So we're going to watch a quick video just to see how these housing practices are still existing in 2020, and then switch gears a little bit.
I'm here, and suddenly my migraine takes me somewhere else, where there's pain and nausea. But Excedrin pulls me back in a way others don't, and it relieves my symptoms fast for real migraine relief.
Last year, Indianapolis native Carlette Duffy set out to buy her grandmother's house. Her plan? Refinance her own home to purchase the property.
I did the application process when they asked, for, do you want to declare, race and gender, nationality? I did all of that, said, yeah, no problem.
Duffy expected her home, which she bought for $100,000 3 years earlier, to appraise for around $185,000.
I was shocked. That it came back at 125. And so I challenged it.
But the appraiser stood by his decision, and the lender didn't budge. So Duffy moved on, going through the process again, this time with Freedom Mortgage. The value placed on her home was even more staggering.
It's $110,000, $15,000 less than the first one, which is less than 3 months earlier.
Duffy again challenged the appraisal to no avail. Duffy applied again through a new lender. This time, she didn't disclose her race or gender in the application process, only communicated with the appraiser via email, and that wasn't all.
I took all of these down so that they wouldn't be seeing my lovely ladies. I took them down. Right before we got to the appraisal portion, I met with two of my girlfriends. Both are married to white men, and I was like, okay, I need to borrow one of y'all husbands.
When the third appraiser came, Duffy was gone. Her friend's husband posed as her brother.
So I was a bit skeptical at first until we saw the results.
The result? Duffy's home was appraised for $259,000, more than double that of her previous two appraisals.
I screamed with joy. I was so elated, and then it quickly dissipated. And then I just cried. Because this is an actual, there it is. And that I'm the thing that's devaluing my house.
The real problem is how we devalue people.
Andre Perry, a senior fellow at Brookings, studies devaluation in Black neighborhoods. Data shows Duffy's experience is not isolated.
It's almost as if when people see a Black neighborhood, they see twice as much crime than there actually is. They see worse education than there actually is, and they value the home in that respect.
On average, homes in neighborhoods where the population is 50% Black are valued at roughly half the price of homes in neighborhoods with no Black residents in U.S. metro areas. Even when controlling for crime, access to schools, and other factors, homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%. That's about $48,000 per home, totaling more than $156 billion in cumulative lost equity.
We have several concerns about the appraisal industry.
Amy Nelson is the executive director of the Fair Housing Center of Central Indiana.
If a neighborhood has been systematically discriminated against because of the race of that neighborhood, decade upon decade, comps then are going to be skewed and they're going to have bias written into them.
This month, Duffy and the Fair Housing Center of Indiana filed a formal complaint with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, alleging race-based discrimination in both her appraisal and lending process.
You are taking away my family's ability to create generational wealth, which is so much more than just words.
NBC received statements from the first two lenders. Both pointed to their use of independent appraisers according to industry standards. Citywide Home Loans denied any discrimination and said they are actively participating in the HUD investigation. Freedom Mortgage said they used an automated valuation model after receiving the complaint and stood by the appraised value. None of the appraisers named in the complaint responded to NBC's request for comment. As for Duffy, she used the money from the third and final appraisal to fulfill that dream of buying her grandmother's home.
That's the house that my grandfather built. I hope to see my grandbaby raised in that house. And then for her to be able to then build on the legacy of her family.
Hey, NBC News viewers.
I'm muted. I had to do it at least once. So I know I'm throwing a lot of information at folks, and I know that can be overwhelming. We are going to take some time to process in a sec. And in terms of talking about specific inequities in the suburbs, I mean, I think we've hit a big one, that the suburbs themselves are created out of systems of oppression, essentially. The suburbs as we know them. When I say that, I'm not talking about, land that just exists outside of cities. And so in terms of,
Thanks for checking out our YouTube.
My PowerPoint.
Last year, India.
Sorry. In terms of thinking about how do we address things that feel so big? So if we're sitting here thinking, wow, the community that we live in, exists as it does due to a system of oppression, what can we do about that? And, one thing that I found as I've been learning about race and racism, and for me, my experience has been, I spent most of my childhood and adult life, actually, my entire life, living in predominantly white suburbs in Southern Connecticut and in Wayland for the last decade. And what I've realized in that time is that when I learn about something new like this, and maybe for folks this is not new, that it can feel really overwhelming, and I'm left feeling like I want to try and solve things and fix them. But when we go back to kind of that whole system and think about the intricacies of everything that we've learned and internalized, and how practices that are so beyond the individual, this is not something that we can, solve in a moment or in a year or in a week. But there are things that we can be doing to start to disrupt that cycle. And so one of the things, the most important thing, is that individual work. We have to kind of go back and look at what we've learned and, kind of piece apart the air you've been breathing. What our experiences have been and the messages that we've received from society, from the ones that we love, and not because we don't love the ones that we love, but because they've been breathing that same air. So it's really important that we do that important individual work of learning missing history and bias, unlearning false history or bias history, and learning about the current status and experiences of others, outside of our experience. That we check and address individual biases, that we pay attention to how bias and racist messaging persists in society, and look for how inequities manifest in our community. And so some of the individual work that everybody can be doing when they leave here is taking a look at systems within our community. Maybe it's the education system, maybe it's town government, maybe it's policing, maybe it's housing. And what are the inequities that are existing? And, just doing that learning to then be able to get to these next steps of doing the with each other work. So some of that community work of helping to educate one another, asking questions, being vulnerable and risking being ignorant, talking to friends, family, colleagues, community members, even when it's hard, talking to our children. And I've mentioned this already many times, but I work a lot in white spaces talking about race because I work and live in the suburbs. And something that comes up a lot is, white folks' role in addressing race and racism. And, we're in a community that is 84% white. How can, we be looking at racism in a community that's so white? So whiteness is a part of racism. And white folks also benefit from racism. So in that regard, white folks have a real responsibility to be learning about our racialized history and the history of racism. And even though, we'd say like potentially unintentional participation in it. And it's also important to be taking the lead from folks of color who've been doing this work for a really long time, people who are leaders in these different systems or dismantling these different systems that I've mentioned, folks who do work around education, do work around addressing equities in housing, do work around addressing equities, inequities in policing systems. Because again, so we want to maybe step in and try and solve problems, fix it now, but there are folks who've been doing this work for a really long time. And also if there are folks of color who have been directly impacted by that work. So just kind of like two pieces to keep in mind. And then also the work that we can be doing as a full community. So things around to disrupt the system itself. The with each other work is preparing the community to be ready to disrupt the system. And then the disrupting the system is making major changes that need to take place. So things like voting, speaking up or out in public forums, pushing back on organizational policies and practices. I'm sure there's many others that I have not thought of. But these were just kind of in piecing up how we can create change. These were three that I thought were important to name. I also want to name that we didn't even touch upon how harmful these dynamics of suburbs can be to folks of color in the day-to-day. The article that I drew a lot of this information from was was a Boston Magazine article about segregation in the suburbs. And at the end, you hear testimony of a Black individual saying, I would rather not live in the suburbs because I'm entering this predominantly white space where folks aren't even talking about or recognizing racism. And as a result, harm can continue to be caused. And I'm not saying that one person speaks for all people, but if you have a community that is predominantly white and doesn't realize that racism is persisting and has been, taught to not talk about race, then the racism kind of continues and can manifest in different ways. So I would love to stop talking for a few minutes. I'm just gonna give you a quick quote. There's no neutrality in the racism struggle. One either believes problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist, or locates the roots of problems in power and policies as an anti-racist. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. And so that kind of gets at the whole, like, we can't say that we're colorblind or that we don't see race, or, I'm just living, I'm just existing because the system exists while we do nothing. And then one other quote that I love to share, because I've always been someone who wants an action list of things to do, is from Crystal Fleming, that no one is going to be able to explain to you in a soundbite what you should do to challenge racism. They simply can't. The answer is going to vary for each individual, depending on your personality and background, interests, talents, and inclinations. So it's your job to figure out how you can best leverage your knowledge and skills to help humanity. And if you don't know the answer to this question quite yet, that's absolutely fine, and in fact, even a good thing, because answering this question requires self-interrogation and thoughtfulness. So take your time, but commit to answering it. No one can solve this riddle for you. So I do want to send folks into breakout rooms, and I also want to do justice to my blurb in advertising this session, which said that I was going to give folks strategies for engaging in conversations around race. And while this may seem simple, my hope is that folks are going to walk away tonight thinking about some of the inequities that might exist in suburbia, in Massachusetts, truthfully all over the country. And maybe thinking about how we might respond, you know, in terms of doing that we have to talk, that piece of we have to talk to each other, to shift mindsets, to shift thinking. So a practice that I've found to be really helpful for me is this idea of felt, found, feel. So we all internalize the messages that we receive from breathing in the air, but from that first, you know, or second stage of the cycle, where we're being kind of culturized. And at the same time, we all have an opportunity to learn and grow and make changes. And so we want to kind of embrace this idea that we can be a culture that does learn and grow and make changes. And so, you know, I once felt that talking about race and racism was racist. And then I learned or found out that that's actually part of the system, that when we don't talk about race and racism, that's where racism and white supremacy can continue to operate and exist. So now I feel that it's really important for us to continue, for myself to continue to learn and talk about these issues whenever possible, so that it can help shift the culture, so that we can actually address inequities at play. And so that's something just that over time I have found to be helpful when people express ideas or make comments. So I thought that we could go back into breakout rooms. Folks could take a couple minutes to just kind of share how they're feeling right now. Putting this in the chat, how are we feeling with the information we've received? And then I'd love for you to practice, maybe just one brave volunteer, one or two brave volunteers, felt, found, feel, for just like a very practical, concrete way that you might leave tonight and try out talking about some of the content that we've heard. And I just have two prompts for you. So let me stop sharing a sec. Or anyone can share their own prompt. But if someone were to say, I'm so glad I live in New England, there's hardly any racism here, how would you respond using felt, found, feel? Using information from tonight or any other time in your life? Or if someone were to say, if people want to buy a home in the suburbs, they should just work harder. Based on tonight, how might you respond using felt, found, feel? I'm going to reopen those same breakout rooms again. We'll just take a few minutes, come back, folks can share thoughts, I can take questions, and then we'll wrap up.
You knocked us right out of the room.
Yeah, sorry. It does the hard stop. Apologies for that. So I'm just gonna start to wrap up, give a few more just kind of mindsets or practices that I have found helpful. I realize that this great presenter talk is not the same as, you know, teaching someone how to fish or how to do a craft, that I've loaded you up with a ton of information and then given you quotes that say things like, no one can tell you how to do this work, you have to figure it out for yourself. So that folks might be having different feelings, but I do appreciate you all kind of hanging in with me and trying on maybe some ideas that you hadn't really considered. So here are a few of those strategies. Just kind of being curious. I think another part of our culture is like vulnerability around what we don't know. And so kind of having that open mindset and asking open-ended questions. Stopping in the moment and addressing topics as they come up, and remembering it's okay to pause a conversation and revisit it later. I think that in order to address habits that we have around maybe not talking about certain things or being afraid to talk about certain things, we never really get over that fear completely, but it gets easier with practice. Just the more that we do it, we start to form new habits. You can use text as jumping off points. I'll give a shout out to the library and to Courtney right now. She's been hosting social justice book group all year. And there's lots of organizations around here that also host book groups or film screenings or talks. And I will share some of those in resources we send out after. That we need to get comfortable talking about race. So naming our own, well, and other social identities, but naming them when appropriate, recognizing the lens that we're coming from, and having allies to practice with. A question I get a lot is, I don't know enough. What if I can't think of the right words? It's okay to admit that we don't have an immediate answer and that we need some time. You can say, I don't know. If you're working with kids, you can say, I don't know, let's learn together, or with friends. So you need to find out more information, encourage other folks to also find out more information, keep educating ourselves, learn terminology, and again, kind of practice. And then another question I get, or two questions really, is what if I say the wrong thing or I say something offensive? And the reality is that we might and probably will. And at the same time, we know that if we say nothing, that we're allowing, even if it's not right in our face, harm, and we may not be feeling shame from that harm, with systems of oppression, they're continuing, even if we say nothing. And so we have to try and say something. So we can own it. We can model that we've made mistakes and survived. Continue to think about intent versus impact. Kind of revamping that like felt, found, feel language. If we've caused harm directly to an individual or group, apologizing as needed and really meaning it. And with that, trying to be okay with not being forgiven. Messaging that I keep talking about messaging I internalized. There's a lot. But that, to be racist or to say racist things was to be bad. And therefore, it's the end of the world if you make a mistake. And again, being racist is not good, but if we recognize that racism is a system that we're all breathing in, then we're kind of all part of that racist system and all have racist ideas and participate in racism. So it's really not about being good or bad. It's about, doing our best to interrogate and push back against the system. And just really trying to be open to criticism and learn from experiences and move forward. And I'm done. And I see questions in the chat. So let me stop sharing.
Can I make a statement?
Sure.
I just want to let you know that in our town, my wife and I, we and a couple other people, we formed this group called the TIDU, the Road to Diversity and Understanding. And we try to make ourselves the mediator in things that come about. Like, if you think this is what's going on with real estate, you can imagine what your 1% in Wayland may be dealing with in a school system that probably is all white and don't have teachers that look like that 1%. So if something goes on, they come to our group and we decide which one of us is going to be the person to help this person be the mediator in whatever the situation is. And we've been working with the police department, school, and different groups. So I think that with your 1% in Wayland, that you probably could start a group there, like they did in Sharon. They have a group in Sharon, Mass. That does the same thing. So, and I think it helps to break down barriers. So,
thank you. Before the break, someone did ask the question, if the house appraised low because it was owned by a Black woman and then appraised higher when a white man appeared to own it, how does who owns it relate to appraisal of a house? It's a great question. And my answer to that would be, I don't know the nuances of housing, but can direct you to The Color of Law, which is a great book that may not directly answer that question. My inclination, though, with that question specifically, it doesn't feel like it's actually about housing. It feels like it's about racism, and that there are still practices that exist in organizations where different racial groups are being treated differently still because of their race. And so to me, it seems like this organization decided that a Black woman did not deserve as much money for her house as a white man did, or it's tied up in, oh, this was a house owned by a white man. We know that white neighborhoods, tend to appreciate more. So we're still in that habit. But there is data around, even just going to buy a car, that a Black man, compared to a white man, is going to be charged $700 more to buy a car than a white man. Like, what is that? So I don't have a great answer. This social construct that exists is pretty messed up. So. Any other questions? Yeah, Peg.
I just wanted to ask Ronald Green, what town do you live in?
Oh, you're muted, Ronald.
Chat. I'm sorry. I was answering the question in the chat. I live in Mansfield.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Who's Ada? I was writing, but I couldn't write fast enough. Someone asked me a question in the chat.
She's waving at you.
Wave again. I missed it. I can't. This thing drives me crazy. Anyway, our group is called the Road to Diversity and Understanding, and it's in Mansfield, and we call it the TRDU. And in Sharon,
the Sharon Race Equity Alliance.
I think Janice, are you on here still? Where is she? I think it's called Sharon. I can't remember what it's called.
I think it's the Racial Equity Alliance.
Yeah,
I work in Sharon, so
okay,
I am familiar with the organization,
yeah,
and I'll send out information about it in the notes.
Thanks.
Yeah, Peg.
We just established a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Commission through the town of Sudbury, which has, I think, 14 members, and it's just got underway. I'm not a member. I wish I were. And but it's interesting. Mr. Green's approach, being troubleshooting in individual situations, that's a great idea. I might want to pass that on to the commission in Sudbury, just going at things in a more organizational way.
Yeah, and there are new organizations popping up in Wayland. Karen, I saw you put your hand up. Did you want to talk about the Human Rights Commission?
Yeah, I was going to say Wayland has, the Board of Selectmen has just approved the formation of a Human Rights, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for the town of Wayland that will, among other things, take complaints and establish a process for dealing with them in a way that is intended to protect the person who's reporting and make sure that they have a safe way for doing that.
Great.
Well, that was a great presentation.
Thank you.
I hate to tell you, I knew it all, but I mean, I did. But it was great.
Are there any other questions? If not, I want to say thank you to Rebecca so much for this presentation, and I am looking forward to sharing all the resources that you've named with everyone via email. So everybody have a great night.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you, Rebecca. Very informative. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.